Well, hello and welcome back to ETCS Bites Back. I know I promised that I would do the next couple on ATO and the other bits of information that the onboard needs, but I got a question asked whilst I was teaching ETCS in Brussels about ETCS security and cybersecurity generally, and how difficult would it be to hack into ETCS? So I thought I'd just do a short talk on that subject. And here we go. So I guess you could call this is a dummy's guide to hacking ETCS. And well, it's not easy. It's not something for dummies. This system is very well designed. I assume that a lot of it is actually designed rather than fortuitous, but the system is very robust and well protected. And I guess the next question we have to ask is, well, why would you want to hack into ETCS? Probably the biggest thing would be to try and cause disruption. And that's something that you can do in many ways without needing to actually hack into the system. If you really want to create a safety event like a train collision or a significant overspeed or something like that, that is much more challenging. So knowing who might be trying to break into the system might help us to understand what are the outcomes that they might be looking for. And I would guess that most will be looking for disruption and the secondary safety and other risks that go with it. So, where and how might you consider hacking into the system? Well, we need to look at where there are potential weaknesses, targets that we could uh, uh, exploit. Obviously, there's the radio network. Radio signals transmitted, anybody can listen to them at any time. And of course, people can generate signals that look like the real thing. We've got the balises mounted in the track, and for some of them, there may be line-side electronic units which configure the messages. These could be a good target, but would they actually help us to cause an incident? Or would it just be disruption? What about the onboards? There are various systems on the train, the actual EVC, the European Vital Computer, but all the ancillary parts of ETCS. Could we attack there? That could be useful if we were wanting to attack one specific train, whereas going for the GSMR network or balises would be to attack multiple trains or the next train along the track. Just with any signaling system, there is an interlocking, and there is a potential that you could hack into the interlocking itself and generate spurious signals, perhaps trying to move a set of points whilst a train is approaching. So the trackside interlocking and the RBC, which generates the movement authorities and is effectively just another interlocking, are a potential area of attack. Nowadays, the signaling system is connected to many other systems, particularly information systems, rostering systems, timetabling systems, and there is information shared to and from. And sometimes those other systems are not so robust as the signaling system in terms of safety criticality. So is there a possibility that by going through one of those ancillary systems, you could cause problems with the ETCS main system? And of course, I can't really talk about hacking and security of ETCS if we don't mention the security keys shared between the onboard and the trackside and used to generate the session keys. So we'll talk a bit about that. One challenge, of course, for people securing ETCS is that the specifications are open. They're well defined and published on the European websites, and you can go and study them and look for weaknesses. We have the diagram here, which you are familiar with from chapter 2 of the ETCS subset 26. And we can see all the various possible interfaces, all described by their own subset. And it is those interfaces that could be a point of weakness. So how is ETCS basically protected, or what are the fundamental features? Well, without any authority being held on board, trains don't move. Now, the normal authority would be a movement authority, but it could be authorization to go into a particular mode. Authority can, of course, also be verbal and operational, such as use of staff responsible on the override procedure. But what that means is that if trains have not got an authority or can't interpret the authority or it's not valid, then the train will be brought to a stand or remain at a stand. So we can't have a potential of an incident. However, if we can't get the authorities to trains, we could have disruption. One of the things that goes with Belize is the ability to use linking information, which confirms that each Belize is where it is expected to be. Most deployments will use linking since it allows the odometry to be corrected and the onboard. And it can be used to detect any Belize which has been added or removed from the system and react as appropriate. Another fundamental is that the onboard is the author of all sessions to the trackside. The onboard is the establisher of the session. In the early versions of ETCS, it was possible for the trackside to call a train, but that then gives you the option that a spoof RBC could contact an onboard and try to establish a session. By making the onboard responsible for establishing sessions, it makes it much harder for a bad actor to interfere with the communications. Also built into the system is the fact that sessions are monitored. Messages have to be received at regular intervals in order for the session to remain valid. And through the national values, you can set up the variables TNV contact and MNV contact so that any loss of messages during the session leads to a safe reaction after a period of time. Those of you who have studied Chapter 4 of Subset 26 will know that all the information received by the onboard goes through a number of filters. Is the information coming from the right type of source, from a Belize or from the RBC? Is it appropriate for the level that the train is currently operating in? What about the mode? Does it relate to the mode the train is in? And is the message completely consistent and in the correct sequence? So there are a number of checks which make it harder for information which could cause a safety event to get through the system. So let's move on to looking at the GSMR network. In the absence of full specs for FRMCS, it's not possible to understand exactly how that would be affected, but it'll probably be very similar. The GSMR network contains multiple base stations, all connected to a data network. Oh, an opportunity. We have a data network. We can go and find the cable, chop it, and insert our own modems or connections. So there's a potential weakness. Actually, it's much easier rather than trying to find the detailed cable and get access to the base station to interfere with the signal. Just having a reasonably powered transmitter nearby to one of the base stations, you can interfere or swamp the signal, meaning that the connection cannot be established. This has been experienced with ETCS, where some GSMR base stations were suffering interference when 5G was being introduced. Another way of doing it is to connect to the base station. I mean, this is basically just a mobile network, mobile phone network, and generate lots and lots of messages. So that results in a denial of service by swamping again the system. But rather than swamping at the radio signal level, you're now swamping it at the data level. An interesting idea would be to use a middleman type attack. If you can create a base station of your own between the onboard and the GSMR base station, then can you detect the signals from the onboard and modify them before sending them on to the GSMR network and vice versa? This would be an interesting way of breaking into the system, but I'm not sure is that practical. And again, it would be quite complicated. Probably the thing that most people think is that, well, why not just spoof the other party? If you're the RBC, you might be talking to an imaginary onboard. And similarly, if you're an onboard, you might be talking to a spoof RBC sitting in somebody's bedroom. Would that work? Could you make that happen? Is that possible? It is potentially possible, but it probably also requires you to be attacking the data network to get messages redirected. You may need to do some middleman attacking as well, or using a denial of service on some other parts of the system so that the activities you're undertaking don't get detected. And remember that the onboard has to establish the connection to the RBC. So in addition, you're probably going to need to change some of the Bleeze group messages to cause the train to contact an RBC in your bedroom instead of the correct one. So talking about the Bleezes and the line-side electronic units, they are of course physically installed on the network, and therefore they are vulnerable to people going and damaging them, removing them, or trying to alter them. However, they come from different suppliers, so there are no generic standard programming tools. You'd need to know who had supplied the Bleeze in order to reprogram it or change its message. We've got the use of linking, as already mentioned, which means that we should know where critical Bleezes are. And there are restrictions on what can be processed within a Belize marked as unlinked. When people were thinking about how to hack, there was a potential, small but possible, of using Belize's marked as unlinked, so hence the train would just accept them, and using them to cause changes to the train configuration. The later versions of the ETCS specifications have restricted what messages can be processed from a Belize that's marked as unlinked. Of course, there's always the chance that someone has the opportunity to reprogram and install Belize. Probably here we're thinking of a disgruntled employee, someone who has been trained and has access to the tools, but has been perhaps not received the promotion they expected, or has been radicalized or something like that. How could they use that knowledge and those tools that they have access to in order to reprogram and install Belize? And if they did so, what could they actually do? Because we're now talking about level 2, it's actually quite restricted what they can use a Belize for. Belize's are primarily marking the location of the train along the track. They are not issuing movement authorities, so there is a limited scope for disruption. Similarly, you can try and corrupt the LEU signal. However, if the signal from the LEU to the Belize is corrupted, the chances are that the default message will be transmitted, and that can also be detected by the onboard, leading to an adverse reaction. And it all comes down to what actually can you send from a Belize that could seriously generate a hazard. If we move into the train itself and the onboard, then there is the potential that the onboard is sharing networks with other equipment on the train. Certainly sharing cabling, even if it is not on the same network. It may well be housed in public areas of a passenger train, which does mean that there is the potential for somebody to be able to break open the cupboard and to do something to the equipment. Particularly, they might be wanting to try and insert a memory drive into a USB socket or something like that. Even sitting next to the equipment, they could be using an RF generator to cause interference, to potentially cause the system to be disrupted. However, in the event of the onboard failing, then the brakes are automatically applied. So again, we have a safe outcome. Also in the onboard is the odometry system. Being able to hack into that and change some of its settings or cause it to generate faulty information could again be a potential to cause an incident. However, we have to remember there are other factors in the system, such as the driver and the train detection systems. As soon as we interconnect any safety critical system to other train systems, there is the potential that a fault could be introduced from those other systems. So even though we may regard a train management system for the driver to understand the status of the traction system as being lower criticality, if it is connected to the main ETCS system, then we need to consider how we prevent messages from that ancillary system affecting the safety critical system. And the same applies with our trackside systems. There is a potential, if someone can get into the system, that they could corrupt the system data or even to change installed software. We need to make sure that there are physical precautions against people getting access to these systems. That also applies to the onboard. We also need to consider how you can change the data and software within those systems, what passwords or special keys are needed. I remember one project I was working on with a software interlocking system from a new supplier, and we were working through the test logs on a system which was, I hasten to add, in use, and the software engineer arrived the next morning to answer the number of test logs and said, "It's okay, I've already installed the new software." As testers, our jaws hit the floor somewhat that someone would go and just install a new set of software onto a live system without any controls. And one wonders what, say, password or other implementations were needed. And again, trackside systems may be on shared data networks, and those shared data networks may be easier for someone to access and then via that network to get into the safety critical part of the system. And talking of those ancillary systems, there's things like the signal as control system. We often think of the interlocking needing to be developed to SIL 4 type levels, but the control system is probably only developed to SIL 2 type levels. And yet, the signal as control system can bombard an interlocking with requests. And a signal as control system displaying incorrect information could lead to hazardous situations because one relies then on operational controls. Another system interfacing with the ETCS is ATO, driver advisory systems. Again, they are working within the constraints of the safety system, but can they begin to generate information which causes the safety system either to shut down or to begin to work outside its normal bounds? Getting more remote, we have timetabling systems. They feed both the signals control system for the setting of routes, but also the ATO system for providing information for the train to be driven. If one is looking at just disrupting the operation of the railway, they could become very vital systems. So disabling a master timetabling system or the ability to share the data with the ATO or the signals control system could cause major disruption. And That applies to other information systems, SCADA systems, uh, passenger information systems, driver rostering systems, fault management systems. All of these systems uh, may be able to be used to disrupt the overall operation of the railway, even if the ETCS is unaffected. So, what about those famous keys that everyone talks about? Keys are the key to ETCS security, I've often heard. Well, are they? Really? Hmm. I think perhaps we need to think again. Yes, each session between an onboard and RBC is authenticated by a shared key, and that key needs to be created for the session, and both the onboard and RBC will use it to generate a check electronic signature on every message they send, and on receiving a message to check that the message has come from the correct source. One thing is that the keys held by the onboard and RBC in order to establish those sessions do not need to be unique. People think they often do, but actually that's not the case. They just need to be the same. And dare one say that some administrations have had the same key used by all of the trains operating on a particular route, talking to a single RBC. They don't have to be different even between the trains, although it is a good idea. Up until baseline 3 was introduction, keys didn't have a validity period. They just lasted forever. But from baseline 3 onwards, keys now have a validity period, so they expire automatically at the date that has been set. And that means that you can update the keys more readily. When a session is being established, so this is when the onboard first connects to a new RBC, a number of random numbers are generated by both the onboard and RBC and combined using the keys that are already held in order to generate a session key. And that session key is the one that is used to authenticate all of the messages until the onboard stops talking to that RBC and moves to the next RBC, or the train is shut down, end of mission, or whatever. What that means is that those sessions are only valid for a short period of time. And that short period of time makes it much harder for anybody to use brute force or other techniques to get hold of the session key or even the secret key that's previously shared. When the specifications for ETCS were initially written, cybersecurity was still being developed, and the key mechanism used was regarded as quite secure. However, nowadays computers are getting much faster. We will soon have quantum computers, no doubt. We've got all the key technology used for things like Bitcoin. So it is actually now practical to try and use brute force to find a session key. However, even if one has that, it makes it you still have to do a lot of other things in order to generate a unsafe event. So you probably think that ETCS is bound to be vulnerable because it uses radio communications, it's a computer system. But actually, most of the people who would try to break into ETCS to make it unsafe will get hacked off with the process because the system is actually very well designed. The fact that trains are continually moving, reporting new positions, they're moving between RBC areas, they're changing connections, means that actually what you haven't got is a stable target to attack, which makes it much more difficult. Making really bad things happen is, based on my analysis at least, very hard. I have seen some reports produced by experts where they have looked at what could happen if ETCS was disrupted, what could be the worst case event. And they have come up with conclusions that a collision is very likely. Well, no, I'm sorry, they have misunderstood risk process. They've taken the worst case event and they've taken the most likely hazard. But the hazard doesn't always lead to that top event. And they've taken the two together to come up with a risk and say, oh, it's bad. You need to employ us to do more research. Whereas actually, the top event often requires multiple event hazards to be in place in order for that top event to be occur. It's the Swiss cheese thing. Um, and actually, the hazards that need to be in place for that top event, the things that someone needs to have done, are very, very remote and very unlikely. Which brings us back to what could someone do? Well, causing disruption, stopping the normal operation, that's actually much easier. Uh, Even as simple as going and removing a Belize from a Belize group can cause disruption because if the Belize group is linked and there is a reaction of a service break, for instance, then removing the Belize and it's then the Belize group is corrupted, faulty, will lead to all the trains being stopped, and it will take time until that Belize can be replaced. So disruption and stopping normal operation is the easy option for someone trying to hack it. And that can be even without going onto the track just by jamming the GSMR radio signals. Which all brings it back to whilst there will be people who will think it's a great thing to try and do, in reality, it's probably more effort than it is worth. There will always be somebody who will try and do it just to prove that they can do it. But when it comes to actually creating a safety hazard and significant ongoing disruption, it is hard to see why someone would bother because the effort, the amount of access you'd need to the systems, the chances of the your interjections being identified in advance, it just doesn't seem worth it to me. So I hope you found that useful, interesting. ETCS is, in my view, very cyber secure. Thank you.